In this episode, we move into a topic that becomes more important the larger and more connected an organization becomes, because very few businesses build and run every technology service entirely on their own. Information technology, IT, vendor management is the discipline of selecting, overseeing, evaluating, and, when necessary, replacing outside companies that provide products or services to support the organization's information systems. For a beginner, the easiest way to picture it is to imagine that the business is relying on other companies for software, hardware, cloud hosting, support, consulting, maintenance, communications, or security functions, which means part of the organization's success now depends on people it does not directly control. That reality creates both opportunity and risk, because vendors can bring expertise and speed, but they can also introduce cost, dependency, security concerns, and service problems. Vendor management exists so that these relationships are handled deliberately, with clear expectations and oversight, instead of being treated like simple purchases that are forgotten after the contract is signed. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good starting point is understanding what a vendor really is in the context of IT, because learners sometimes think only of major software companies or well-known cloud providers. In practice, a vendor can be any outside party that provides a technology-related good or service, including managed service firms, hardware suppliers, software developers, data center providers, payment processors, internet service providers, consultants, contract developers, equipment maintenance partners, and security monitoring companies. Some vendors supply something simple and low risk, such as replacement devices or routine licensing, while others support services that are absolutely critical to daily operations and may handle sensitive information at the same time. That difference matters because not every vendor relationship deserves the same level of attention, review, and control. A company that delivers office keyboards does not create the same level of business exposure as a company that stores customer data, processes payroll, or runs a critical application. Vendor management helps the organization recognize those differences so it can apply the right amount of scrutiny, monitoring, and governance to each relationship. The reason this topic matters so much is that a vendor can affect the organization's operations, reputation, compliance position, finances, and security posture even though the vendor is technically outside the business. If an outside provider suffers an outage, delivers poor support, mishandles confidential information, or fails to meet contract terms, the customer organization still bears much of the damage. Users may not care whether the failure happened in-house or at a vendor site, because from their perspective the business they depend on simply did not perform as expected. This is why vendor management is not merely a purchasing activity or a legal paperwork exercise. It is part of how the organization maintains service quality, protects information assets, and ensures that business goals are being supported by reliable outside partners. Once a company depends heavily on vendors, weak oversight can create blind spots where important processes continue to function only until a disruption reveals that responsibilities, controls, or expectations were never fully understood. One of the most important beginner lessons is that vendor management is a life cycle rather than a single event. Many people think the hard part is choosing a vendor, but selection is only the beginning of the relationship. The life cycle usually starts with identifying a business need, then defining requirements, evaluating possible vendors, negotiating terms, onboarding the chosen provider, monitoring performance, reviewing risk over time, renewing or adjusting the agreement if needed, and eventually ending the relationship in a controlled way. Problems often appear when organizations focus heavily on the first step and then lose discipline after the contract is signed. A vendor may be carefully reviewed during procurement, but once the service is running, nobody tracks performance, validates controls, or plans for what happens if the provider fails or the contract ends. Good vendor management recognizes that oversight must continue throughout the entire relationship because the business environment, the vendor's condition, and the organization's own needs can all change over time. Before a vendor is selected, The organization should be clear about what it actually needs, because weak internal clarity often leads to weak vendor outcomes. If the business cannot describe the service it wants, the data involved, the expected results, the availability requirements, the support model, or the key risks, then it becomes much harder to compare providers or write meaningful contract terms. This is why needs assessment comes before selection and not after. A company should understand which processes are being supported, which users will rely on the service, what information will be shared, what regulations apply, and what level of interruption would be acceptable. Without that groundwork, an organization may choose a vendor based on price, reputation, or persuasive marketing rather than actual fit. Vendor management begins with internal discipline, because outside providers can only be evaluated intelligently when the customer knows its own priorities, limitations, and control expectations well enough to ask the right questions. When the organization is ready to compare vendors, structured evaluation becomes important because first impressions and polished sales presentations do not tell the full story. A common method is a request for proposal, or FP, which is a formal way of asking vendors to explain how they would meet specific business and technical needs. Even when an RFP is not used, the organization should still assess factors such as experience, stability, security practices, support model, scalability, implementation approach, financial condition, reputation, and ability to meet contractual obligations. For high-impact services, decision-makers should look beyond product features and ask whether the vendor can consistently deliver under real business conditions. A solution may appear attractive in a demonstration but still be a poor choice if the vendor lacks mature support, has weak control practices, or depends heavily on subcontractors the customer knows nothing about. Strong vendor selection is therefore about evidence and fit, not just excitement, convenience, or cost. Risk assessment becomes especially important once the organization realizes that different vendors create different types of exposure. A vendor that only ships replacement equipment may present mainly supply and quality concerns, while a vendor that manages customer records, authentication services, or financial transactions may create serious confidentiality, integrity, availability, and compliance risks. Organizations often apply some form of third-party risk management, TPRM, to classify vendors by criticality and sensitivity so that more important relationships receive more careful review. This may include examining security controls, business continuity capability, incident response readiness, legal obligations, insurance, financial health, and the vendor's own use of subcontractors. The purpose is not to eliminate all risk, because no relationship is risk-free, but to understand what could go wrong and whether the organization can tolerate it. For a beginner, the main idea is simple. The more critical the service and the more sensitive the data, the more disciplined the oversight needs to be before the relationship begins and while it continues. Contracts are one of the clearest tools the organization has for turning expectations into obligations, which is why vendor management depends heavily on careful contract design. A contract should do more than identify price and payment terms. It should define services, responsibilities, performance expectations, support hours, security requirements, data ownership, confidentiality expectations, compliance responsibilities, audit rights, reporting requirements, change processes, and what happens if service levels are not met. Service Level Agreement, SLA, terms are especially important because they make performance measurable by setting targets for availability, response time, resolution time, or other service commitments. Good contracts also address practical issues such as data retention, breach notification, dispute resolution, and termination support so that problems are not handled through guesswork later. Beginners should remember that a contract does not guarantee good service by itself, but it gives the organization a formal basis for accountability. And without that basis, managing a vendor relationship becomes much more difficult when performance slips or priorities change. Once a vendor is chosen, onboarding is the point where plans begin to meet reality, and this is where many weak relationships start to show stress. Onboarding includes setting up access, defining communication paths, confirming responsibilities, validating security controls, establishing reporting schedules, and making sure both sides understand how the service will operate day to day. If onboarding is rushed, The organization may grant broader access than necessary, fail to document responsibilities clearly, or launch the service before support and escalation procedures are truly ready. That creates confusion at exactly the stage when trust and routine are still forming. Good vendor management treats onboarding as a control point rather than as a simple administrative step. The organization should know who owns the relationship internally, who approves changes, how incidents will be reported, how performance will be reviewed, and how issues will be escalated. This early discipline reduces misunderstandings and makes the rest of the relationship easier to govern because roles and expectations are visible from the start. Monitoring the vendor over time is where management becomes ongoing rather than theoretical, because a relationship that was sound at the beginning can weaken gradually if nobody is watching. Organizations often track performance through key performance indicators, KPIs, service reports, review meetings, audit evidence, incident trends, user feedback, and renewal discussions. The goal is not simply to collect paperwork, but to understand whether the vendor is continuing to meet business needs in practice. A provider may technically satisfy one metric while still frustrating users through poor communication, repeated small failures, or slow problem resolution. That is why vendor oversight should combine formal measures with informed judgment about service quality and control effectiveness. Regular reviews also help the organization notice drift, such as repeated exceptions, delayed patching, staff turnover at the vendor, or unexplained changes in subcontracting. Vendor management works best when it treats performance as something that must be verified continuously, not assumed forever because the relationship started well. Security and privacy concerns deserve special attention because vendors often store, transmit, process, or support systems containing information the organization is responsible for protecting. When an outside company touches sensitive data, the risk does not disappear simply because the data moved to someone else's environment. The organization still has an obligation to understand how that data is protected, who has access to it, how incidents will be handled, and what legal or regulatory duties apply. Strong vendor management therefore asks about access controls, logging, encryption, background screening, secure development, vulnerability management, retention practices, and breach notification expectations where relevant. It also considers whether the vendor's controls are independently reviewed and whether those reviews are recent and meaningful. For a beginner, the central lesson is that outsourcing a service does not outsource accountability. The organization may delegate tasks to a vendor, but it cannot fully delegate responsibility for knowing whether the service is being delivered in a secure, compliant, and reliable manner. Relationships with vendors are not only technical and contractual, they are also managerial and human, which means communication and accountability matter greatly. A vendor relationship can fail even when the contract is reasonable and the technology works well if there is no clear owner inside the organization, no regular communication, and no process for resolving disagreements before they grow. Good vendor management assigns internal responsibility for oversight, keeps business and technical stakeholders aligned, and ensures that concerns are raised early rather than tolerated until they become urgent. Healthy relationships are not based on blind trust or constant conflict. They are based on clarity, evidence, responsiveness, and the understanding that both sides benefit when expectations are discussed openly and performance issues are addressed directly. This is especially important for long-term partnerships where business needs may evolve over time. An organization that communicates well with its vendors is better positioned to adapt, negotiate improvements, and recognize warning signs before service quality or control effectiveness begins to erode. An important but often overlooked part of vendor management is planning for change, failure, or exit before those events happen. Organizations sometimes become so comfortable with a vendor that they overlook how dependent they have become until renewal terms worsen, service declines, or a major incident forces rapid decisions. Exit planning means understanding how data will be returned or destroyed, how access will be revoked, how services will transition, how knowledge will be retained, and whether another provider or internal team could realistically take over if needed. Without this planning, a company may feel trapped in an unsatisfactory relationship because leaving appears too risky or disruptive. Vendor management, therefore, includes avoiding unnecessary lock-in and making sure the organization preserves enough control, documentation, and leverage to change direction when circumstances require it. Beginners should see this as part of resilience rather than pessimism. Planning for exit is not a sign that the organization expects failure. It is a sign that it understands responsible stewardship and refuses to let convenience turn into dangerous dependency. From an audit perspective, IT vendor management matters because outside relationships can expose the organization to operational, financial, security, and compliance problems if oversight is weak or inconsistent. An auditor is likely to ask whether vendor selection is risk-based, whether contracts reflect business and control needs, whether performance is monitored, whether critical vendors receive enhanced review, and whether management can demonstrate accountability throughout the vendor lifecycle. Evidence may include due diligence records, risk assessments, contracts, SLA reports, performance reviews, issue logs, security attestations, incident history, and termination procedures. The auditor is not just checking whether paperwork exists, but whether the organization understands the significance of its vendors and manages those relationships in a way that matches the risk they create. For a CISA learner, this is a good example of how governance, risk, operations, compliance, and security meet in one practical area. A vendor relationship may look external on the surface, but the organization's internal control strength is often revealed by how well that external relationship is chosen, monitored, and managed. The central message should feel clear and useful. IT vendor management is the disciplined oversight of outside providers whose products or services help the organization operate its information systems, and that oversight must continue from initial need through selection, contracting, monitoring, and eventual exit. It matters because vendors can expand capability and accelerate progress, but they can also create blind spots, dependencies, and serious risk if the organization treats them as ordinary purchases instead of as important business relationships requiring structure and accountability. As you continue studying, keep noticing how vendor management connects to service quality, risk awareness, governance, contract clarity, security, and continuity, because all of those concerns become more visible once another company is involved in delivering a critical function. A beginner who understands that connection will be able to think more like an auditor and less like a casual buyer. That shift in thinking is one of the most valuable habits you can build as you move forward in your CISA preparation.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.